a lot has been going on in China in the last few weeks, and I gave a lot of thought to changing my topic, especially given the events of the last few days with what's happening with zero COVID. But I think right now it's just too early to do more than speculate on what will happen. But I've talked to Richard, and he and I are both happy to field questions on this topic at the end of my talk, which I'll try to keep as close to the time as possible. So today's title, The Great Decoupling, and it's a tale of the last 20 years. When I was the executive editor of AsiaWeek, one of the last cover stories we did was on China's entry to the WTO, World Trade Organization. And that entry that has completely transformed the world, both trade and politics. Oops. China's entry into the World Trade Organization has transformed global trade and economics and politics in ways no one could have predicted 20 years ago. Deng's opening and reforms changed China, but as you can see from this chart, 2001 marked the real beginning of the Chinese miracle. It went from roughly 4% of global trade and GDP to over 14%. In the process, China became the world's factory. Millions of jobs shifted from developed countries to China and resulted in huge trade imbalances, particularly with the United States. The gap is, again, you can see it begins in 2000, and it has now become close to over $500 billion a year. This was driven by low-cost labor and supply chain efficiencies. But it was also driven by China's pledge that it would open its markets to the outside world. The assumption was that over time, China would become both a major market as well as a supplier. And that drew thousands of foreign investors and businesses, both to manufacture there and to try to gain a foothold in the market of over 1 billion people. In the meantime, it has created great codependencies. China became intertwined with the operations of practically every major manufacturing firm in the world. And while perhaps not in dollar value of trade, certainly in terms of technology and intellectual property, China became itself equally dependent on foreign firms. The Chinese began to realize that codependency and take steps to lessen it over almost 15 years ago. It began to realize that it was becoming far too reliant on intellectual property from the outside that could be cut off. And so in 2006, they came up with this idea of indigenous innovation. The National Medium and Long-Term Plan for Development of Science and Technology was by 2020 supposed to make China self-sufficient in terms of major technologies. And this is from their own report. One should be clearly aware that the importation of technologies without emphasizing the assimilation, absorption, and re-innovation is bound to weaken the nation's indigenous research and development capacity. At the time, the plan was considered by many international technology companies to be a blueprint for technology theft on a scale the world has never seen before. Xi Jinping decided to re-up this, up the stakes even more. He, in 2013, began this policy called Made in China, something that I've talked about in the past. In that, it created a 10-year plan to update China's manufacturing base by developing 10 high-tech industries. And the ultimate goal was to reduce China's dependence on foreign technology and promote high-tech manufacturers, with semiconductors a particular area of influence. He also made state-owned enterprises the focal point of economic development, going away from the previous trend that had started by Zhu to emphasize private enterprises. The idea was to insulate China from outside influences while maintaining access to markets and even increasing demands for technology transfers, something that many Western companies began to complain about. Excellent. And then came Donald Trump. Trump chose to make attacking China a centerpiece of his foreign policy, and beginning in 2018, used the meat cleaver approach, the sledgehammer approach to foreign trade by imposing massive tariffs on China and Chinese trade. He also and his advisors began using quite intemperate language about the Chinese threat and making additional threats of their own. Next. Trump also, the tariffs as it happened really didn't seem to hurt China that much. It seemed to mostly, the costs, as any economist would tell you, were largely passed on to American consumers with a little bit of thinning of corporate profits. But Trump also began to focus on key Chinese technology firms, particularly Huawei, which basically Trump banned from selling major technological telecommunications equipment in the United States, and eventually got many of our allies to agree to also stop using Huawei technology. And this had an amazingly potent effect on Huawei's future and its growth. Well, probably before 2018, but at least by 2018, Trump, the American business community began to feel the pressure. Trump's ham-fisted xenophobia didn't occur in a vacuum. China's major trading partners, particularly the US and EU, were slower to accept the dangers of the codependency than China was. And they really were reluctant to realize just how far China would go to game the system. Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary and longtime cheerleader for US-China economic integration, was ironically one of the first business leaders to raise that alarm publicly. So a lot of firms, as I said, in China had long been complaining about market access and technology transfers. This was really a remarkable speech that he made in 2018 in Singapore, and I've highlighted the most important comment in it. The prevailing view in the US is that China is increasingly content to pursue its own standards, privilege its domestic rules, and erect rather than demolish walls for foreign competitors. So by this point, the gloves were pretty much off. And then came Biden. And there was some hope, I think, in China that Biden would get and by among American corporations that Biden would cut the tariffs. But Trump and his team weren't wrong about the one-sided nature of our relationship with China. And contrary to expectations, Biden did not and still has not cut those tariffs. Biden also began to shore up relations with our traditional trading partners to try to build a coalition to try to encourage China to play by the rules. And that was certainly something that Trump had not done. And I believe most analysts would say that this is one of the reasons that the Biden policy has been as effective as it has. It's not been unilateral, it's been multilateral. And then came COVID. Really, the scales fell from a lot of people's eyes in terms of how China's nationalistic, mercantilistic approach to global trade and just global politics was with their response to COVID. They were not shy about using PPE and masks and the like as diplomatic leverage. They refused from the beginning to cooperate on finding the sources with COVID, which had not happened, by the way, the last time China had a big viral outbreak, the SARS epidemic. They really began touting China's success in halting the spread and especially making a point of saying how many people died in the democracies as opposed to China. And finally, they engaged in something that I'm calling vaccine chauvinism. And that is, in spite of the fact that Chinese vaccines turned out not to be that effective, Xi Jinping and his national team have absolutely rejected the use of any foreign vaccines. Next slide, please. And then came Ukraine. I think everyone was surprised by pretty much by everything that's happened since February 23rd. The invasion was February 24th. And surprised by the invasion. I'm pretty sure China was surprised by the invasion as well, but also surprised by how well Ukraine has resisted, and more importantly, by the unified global response to Russia's invasion. I think that really has caused the Chinese to step back and think about their own vulnerabilities to trade and financial embargoes. And now the CCP, the Communist Party of China, is redoubling its attempts to reduce China's vulnerability to sanctions and export restrictions. And I think this has also given Western businesses a pause when they think about those sanctions. What if China invaded Taiwan? What would happen to all of their business ties? They all were erased. Their Russian enterprises have all had to be wrapped up. They're far more reliant on China. So I think a lot of Western businesses are totally reassessing their exposure there as well. Next one, please. And then there's the Xi factor. As you all know, he has just been made given a third term as party secretary, and will probably be president for another 5 years as well. Xi Jinping has tried to develop a personality cult. He has taken personal ownership of this zero COVID policy, a saber rattling over Taiwan, and this whole idea now that there is no succession plan. That picture is of his predecessor, Hu Jintao, being escorted, really sort of hustled off of the stage at the Chinese Communist Party Congress last month, or 2 months ago. Many people believe it was because he was trying to look at a list of who was going to be on the Politburo, and none of his allies made it on that list, including the guy to his right there, Li Keqiang. Anyway, a lot of Western businesses who initially maybe thought it was great to have a really tough authoritarian ruler who could get things done are now beginning to have second thoughts about just how tenable that sort of rule is. The vaccine chauvinism is perhaps the strangest thing for many people to understand. BioNTech had an agreement with Shanghai Fosun Pharmaceutical Group to provide the doses and to have Fosun make them in Shanghai. And in fact, they do make the vaccine in Shanghai for the rest of East Asia. But the vaccine has never received Chinese regulatory approval. It's the only major country in the world that has not given it its approval. Moderna has been trying to do a deal with China, but Chinese officials wanted the company not only to provide the doses, but hand over the intellectual property. And Moderna, and there's enough that we can have that discussion separately, whether or not these should be held by private hands. But in any case, Moderna was not willing to make that deal. There's another strange thing that's happened with vaccines. China is an authoritarian country. I don't think anyone would doubt that. And they have used amazing methods to lock down whole communities. They welded people's doors shut. And yet the vaccine take-up, especially among elderly, is very, very low.
And there are many people who wonder why China didn't try harder to get more people to get the shot. Again, partially it's believed because they just don't trust the vaccines, even their own. Next slide, please.
And while this was going on, we've also had a big change on the defense front, national security. Anyway, in addition to the more quotidian technological threats posed by Chinese companies like Huawei, ZTE, and TikTok, in the past year, its advances in quantum computing and artificial intelligence have begun to worry Western defense analysts because these advances have direct impact on military and security issues. And you can see from this story, which I think was back in April, China basically had taken the lead in quantum computing. Quantum computing is essential in doing simulations, their hypersonic weapon systems, all of those things rely heavily on advanced computing. So as a result, in August, the Bureau of Industry and Security of the U.S. Department of Commerce issued an order imposing a presumption of denial to exports of a certain category of electronic design automation software. These are the machines that make the very, very high-end chips that are essential to quantum computing and many, many other advanced technological requirements. They are essential for producing the most advanced chips needed in the development of server capacity and supercomputers, advanced machine learning systems able to process complex scenarios involving a large number of data, or to model weapons systems. They all need these cutting-edge chips. And when this crackdown came down, there was a real, it surprised, I think, many, many people, because it was overnight. In fact, at least 50 American citizens or people who hold American passports or green cards had to leave their Chinese jobs within that next week or so. I mean, this was the most draconian technological crackdown since the Cold War. Next one, please. And I think it really took China by surprise as well. I think the Chinese just assumed that American corporations had enough power over the American government to prevent this sort of thing from happening, because there is no way in the world that China was ready to give up all of these technological advances. In spite of tens of billions of dollars in investment, China's high-end chip manufacturing industry remains years behind the US, Taiwan, South Korea, and the EU. They may not catch up for even 10 or 20 years, and it's not clear they can catch up, because they will be walled off from the intellectual property and the scientific advancements that they would otherwise have knowledge of. This also comes at a time when the US government has decided that the new globalization, this is US Trade Representative Catherine, who says that the new version of globalization, our firms, our governments need to be focused on decision-making and behaviors that are not just focused on efficiency and chasing the lowest cost, but where we're all incentivized to reward and build towards resilience. Globalization 1.0, yes, it lifted many, many boats, but it left behind millions and millions of people, workers around the world, who were just not paid attention to. And I think we've really been experiencing the fallout from that over the last 8 or 9 years in American politics. So resilience through decoupling. So US industries are beginning to decouple. They're beginning to decouple because of high-tech sanctions, because of the challenges of COVID, the fear of human rights backlash, especially over Xinjiang, over the possibility of an invasion of Taiwan, and then also because of Xi Jinping's unfettered power. Next, please. So the the push for diversification, Apple is moving 40 to 45% of its iPhone production to India and Vietnam. It was crazy for it to be so reliant on one source, but that's the way it was. U.S. firms are also switching to non-Chinese chips. There's a lot of blowback for Western brands caught using materials and labor from Xinjiang. So there is a very slow migration away from China. Next, please. So sometimes this is called reshoring or friendshoring. That is, it's if we have it built on our own land or on that of our allies. But the U.S. government also has directed $280 billion. This is one of the great bipartisan accomplishments of the Biden administration to rebuild the high-tech industry in America, which had become, like everybody else, far too dependent on China. So it is beginning, next one, please. We are beginning to see China's share of global exports falling. It's small, but it has to start somewhere. Next slide, please. And there are many other weapons that may be used in the next few years. Anyway, there are a bunch of new measures that are being recommended by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which was, by the way, was created by Congress after China entered the WTO to make sure that it did obey the rules, and it hasn't been paying much attention, and now it is. So there is a chance that China could lose permanent normal trade relations, which used to be called something like most favored nations treaty, which would have an enormous impact. There's also one of the most interesting things they're calling for is that the FDA identify pharmaceutical products that utilize active pharmaceutical ingredients sourced directly or indirectly from the PRC, which again is an area of great vulnerability. All that said, American companies have made a lot of money. Foreign companies have made a lot of money. German auto industry is entirely dependent on China for its profits. And so this is going to be a slow process. But I think we're beginning to see an era when the trade relationship may become a little bit more equal. There may be more reciprocity than we've seen before. And I'd like to close on a thought that I believe. I think Xi Jinping, in spite of all of his successes of late, has begun to blink. He just abandoned zero COVID, which I don't think anyone could have predicted. Wolf warrior diplomacy, which I've talked about in the past, has been toned down considerably. The threats to Taiwan have been softened, at least for now. There are reports that the Chinese are starting to try to be a little bit more transparent in terms of the military relations of their companies, so that by explaining how that works to Americans. So it is entirely possible that we could be seeing the beginning of a new era of a better, more even-handed relationship with China, because it is in no one's interest for these two nations or for the world to turn its back on China and its creativity and its production. And so perhaps the great decoupling will not be such a great decoupling after all. And I'll turn it over to questions. Thank you.
Rick, thank you for a great presentation as usual. And if you will put your questions in the chat, then I will be happy to pass those on verbally to Rick for answering. So the first one, Rick, is an anonymous question, but it's still a good question. Concerning the United States blocking China access to cutting-edge chips, aren't most of those, especially high-end, made in Taiwan, which would further increase their desire to take over that island?
Well, many are.
Actually, what's really being stopped right now is the equipment that makes the chips. Some of that comes from the United States. A lot of the design comes from the United States. A lot of it comes from the Netherlands. There's one particular company in the Netherlands. But yes, Taiwan has plays a huge role in China, especially TMSC, which, by the way, I skipped over it in my slide, but which just broke ground for a new $40 billion chip fabricator in Phoenix, Arizona. So, yeah, it may well be that Taiwan is worried that this increases their vulnerability. But by the same token, if Taiwan stops sending chips to the mainland because of a war, a lot of Chinese industry would come to a halt because those chips are absolutely crucial. And China simply cannot produce anything approaching the highest tech chips.
Could you do a little another question? I'm still waiting for more questions on the chat relevant to the speech. Could you do a little deeper dive on the decisions around zero COVID, Rick, as far as the Chinese government's expenditure of funds?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, zero COVID, I think all the epidemiologists I've read agree made sense as long as you use the time that you bought to build up the immunity of your people through vaccinations. Because with zero COVID, there is no natural immunity. Nobody is catching COVID. China has been described as the most COVID naive population on the planet. That is, they are much more vulnerable to the virus. And the Chinese vaccines, as I said before, are not very effective, maybe 50%, which is not nothing. That's not, a good flu vaccine is like that. But it's not enough to keep things from getting out of control. Basically, what happened was the Chinese Xi Jinping found himself in a situation where there was no easy way out of zero COVID. There was no off-ramp. So I think they simply decided to rip off the Band-Aid, but they did it at a very bad time because, again, one of the things that they didn't do during this 2.5 years that they had zero COVID in place was to beef up their hospitalization, their emergency rooms. People in China go to the hospital when you're sick. It's not like, you wait until you've got a broken leg or something like that. I mean, it's the main provider of healthcare. And it's simply, everything I've read, simply unprepared for the kind of onrush. There may well be tens of millions of COVID infections in the next few months. And instead of building these hospitals, they spent a lot of money on quarantine camps, on these, that held 10 or 20,000 people, which they're now, I think, closing. So, as you said earlier, there's a sort of hubris to this. We have the right idea and we're going to stick with it because we're the Communist Party of China and no one can tell us what to do. Left unsaid in this I guess the real question is why now? And some people think it's because of the demonstrations. I think it's because the economy was coming close to imploding. Economic growth, there's every chance that the Chinese economy is shrinking right now because of all of these COVID restrictions. And I think they just felt they had to. Look at the Zhengzhou Foxconn plant in Zhengzhou that produces all the iPhones, and they're producing something like 20% of their normal output. That's just not sustainable. And so I think it was more an issue of needing to do something to get the economy going. And it's probably going to take 6 months before the economy gets going because, like I said, the next few months are going to be fraught. No one knows what's going to happen. And I'm hopeful that they wearing masks and other things will, and the fact that it's the Omicron variants are not as serious. I'm hoping against hope that there's not so much, not as many deaths as some people are projecting. But it could well be quite a horrible scene.
Thank you. Next question is let me get here. Sorry, has to do with about the your final comment about the Biden and Xi meeting. The question is, does Xi Jinping's blinking, so to speak, at that meeting represent a vindication of China hawks that the U.S. must play hardball with China after the pre-Trump decades of trying to negotiate and be sort of softer towards the China developments?
Yes, with a qualification. I would say not hawk, but China realist. I mean, there have been many people, and I was one of them, and I think you were as well, who have watched with dismay over the last, especially 10 years or 15 years, as China basically broke every agreement they made to get into the WTO. And the Obama administration, they treated Obama terribly. They made him go out the back end of his Air Force One upon arrival in China, which Richard, that's not an accident. And so I think that the U.S. and the rest of the world was so driven by profits and by efficiencies that they just decided not to hold China to account. And so, yes, I think Trump wasn't wrong about everything. I certainly think he was wrong about the way he approached China, but not the idea that China needed to be that we needed a sense of reciprocity. And so I think that's sort of what's going on now. And yes, so I agree. I think they will respond in time. And it's too bad that it took this long, because I don't think this has been good for China either.
Right. Now, referring to your slide with the firm and friendly handshake between President Putin and Xi Jinping, the question is there a scenario where you see Xi walking back his unlimited friendship with Putin? Do you see any decoupling between China and Russia?
And I can't say decoupling, but I certainly don't think that the embrace is quite as unlimited as before. I'm old enough to have covered or been around for the Sino-Soviet split back in the 60s, China and Russia have many natural sympathies, but they have also a lot of enmity between them. And so they're always going to be watching over their shoulder. But I think for the time being, they're pretty well invested in food. And frankly, it's not hurting China that much right now. They're getting cheap oil. They're giving Putin basically nothing. Every once in a while, I think China, and this is where this wolf warrior diplomacy comes in, I think every once in a while, China will probably throw a bone to the rest of the world and condemn Russia for doing something or vote one way or another in the UN. But I certainly don't see them splitting. That would be very, very difficult.
Thank you for that. This question is from Christian Wright. I apologize to other questioners not giving your name. If you put in the chat your question to everyone, I can see the full name. As I say, this one is back to chips. Can you talk about why it would take so long for China to develop its own high-end chip manufacturing?
Yeah, well, I'm now talking about something that I really can't understand myself, but what the experts say is that it's sort of like chip making is both a science and an art. And what Taiwan has done, what Intel has done, what the Dutch, they have been working on these processes for decades.
Somebody said there's a wonderful study that the Chinese themselves did on why it's taking so long for them to catch up in certain areas, and one of them involves the lenses that are used to do the etching, and they're apparently all produced by Zeiss in Germany because they've been making lenses for centuries. So it's not the sort of thing that you can steal and reverse engineer, because they've tried to do that. I remember back when I was covering the Soviet Union in the 70s, talking to U.S. export control people and businesses, and the consensus was that they can always catch up, they can always reverse engineer something,
but it's going to take them 4 or 5 years, and by the time they do that, we've moved on to
the next stage. And so yes, they will eventually be able to get to 5 nanometer chips, but by then, we're already, at 2. In fact, I think right now they're not even capable of doing the 10. And these are, again, for most things, it's not that important, but for the really high-end stuff and like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, those chips are essential. They're not the ones that go into your car or your toaster oven.
Excuse me. Next question is from Ronald Brown, Rick. This refers to Biden's initiation of a new law fighting China's human rights issues, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, which adds lost profits and economic pressures to rhetoric about improving human rights in China. This might be a related example of decoupling, kind of a ban really, and useful in the developing scenario for U.S.-China relations going forward. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I did mention the Xinjiang issue and the way corporations are reacting to it. I think the biggest push for that is mostly reputational damage, brand damage. I noticed the Rolling Stones have just dropped Shine as one of their sponsors for their world tour because Shine has been caught using Xinjiang forced labor. So I think just like again, it's great that the Biden administration is taking a more holistic approach to relations with China. It's not just technology, it's not just market access, it's also human rights. And to me, the disappointing thing about what's the world's reaction to what's happening in Xinjiang is the Middle East. Xi Jinping is in Saudi Arabia right now, visiting with Mohammed bin Sultan, and I'm sure Xinjiang isn't going to come up. Why not? Anyway, I do think that the Xinjiang, the Forced Labor Act is important, and again, I think it's part of a whole panoply of things that need to be done to get China to when China entered the WTO, the assumption was that it would become a positive partner in the global organization, that it would, yes, insist on rule changes, but that it would embrace this and become part of the global community. And it looked like that's where they were heading. But over the last 10 years, 12 years, maybe longer, 15, I think that hope is gone. And I think it's time that we at least ask them to do something. Remind them of their promises.
Right. Well, this is an interesting question on, you might say, the sustainability of mindset and whether we've reached an inflection point where there's real change. Mm-hmm. The question is the quote, China has seen the light and will change prediction in the actually reflected in the on-the-ground discussions among the Chinese elite? Or is it just us projecting our own values and hopes and desires onto them?
Well, it's almost always the latter.
We've been guilty of this before, but is there a real, is there a sea change?
No, I know absolutely. You know, we've all seen this movie before. We never fail to sort of transpose our thoughts on all other cultures, regimes, and so forth. But I do think that they are rational actors. They're not irrational actors, and I think they can make their own judgments about what's going to be necessary going forward. As I said, I think Xi Jinping miscalculated. I think he thought that you know, this indigenous innovation, made in China stuff was going to work. They spent hundreds of billions of dollars on chips. Their most famous science technical university, their MIT, Tsinghua, you know, they had their own chip company, which basically went bankrupt after wasting tens of billions of dollars. You know, innovation, go back to that previous, innovation can't be ordered up. Just ask Bill Gates about that. Look at all the money that Microsoft spent over the years trying to innovate, you know, just throwing money at it. It doesn't work that way. And I think, you know, the emphasis on state-owned enterprises has also made it more difficult. It's certainly not a very conducive place for entrepreneurship, which is, again, where a lot of innovation comes from. You know, I use this a lot, but a friend of mine used to work for Rolls-Royce jet engines, and, you know, China still can't produce a commercial jet engine. And they've spent hundreds of billions over the years. I mean, they need it. They have to buy their jets from, you know, their military from Russia. You can't decree progress. And maybe there are people in the leadership, and maybe even Xi Jinping, who are going to at least take that into consideration.
We've got time for, I think, just one more question, Rick, and this is back to the chip technologies and so forth. And the question is, will other countries, such as South Korea, follow the U.S. lead in limiting chip technology sales to China, or they continue business as usual, undermining attempts to limit that semiconductor technology flow to China? To which I would add, especially critical because such a high percentage of Korea's exports go to China. So there's an economic coercion possibility there should they decide to be more restrictive.
Now, I'm sure that there will be leakage. There'll be significant leakage. And you know, people don't like to be told what to do. A week or so ago, a Dutch Minister of Industry announced that we will not be told by America what to do when it comes to these. They have the greatest chip design technology. But 2 days ago, they announced that they weren't going to sell any more of those machines to China. I think at the very, very top end, this is going to be pretty complete. At the sort of middle to, you know, not, well, I think, yeah, there'll be a lot of slippage, and the Americans will accept that. I mean, it's part of your relationships. We, you know, do this sort of thing all the time. But I think at the margins, the places where China needs this high tech these materials the most, I think it is going to hurt. You know, China has a lot of leverage over the United States. We get all our lithium-ion batteries from there. You know, there are ways that they could retaliate. Sure. So you know, this is not going to be neat. But I do think, you know, maybe it is, if not an inflection point, at least you know, maybe it's the beginning of the beginning of a new sort of more equal's not the right word, but more even-handed relationship between China and its Western trading partners.
Okay, well, thank you.